Detective Agatha Marple, The Orange Blossom Special Express, a detective mystery tale. The rain fell in a relentless curtain, striking the roof of the train with a steady, drumming force. The Orange Blossom Special gleamed as it prepared for departure, the polished brass fittings and etched glass windows promising luxury within, no matter the tempest without. As passengers hurried aboard, sheltering their fine hats and gloves under hastily raised umbrellas, a flash of lightning illuminated the platform, turning the scene for a moment into a stark white tableau. Inside, the grand salon glowed warmly, its chandeliers casting a golden light over a crowd of travellers who, for all their poise and laughter, carried an air of unspoken anticipation. A man in a finely tailored pinstripe suit leaned against the piano, his polished shoe tapping lightly on the carpet as he spoke animatedly to a woman bedecked in jewels. She responded with a lilting laugh, one gloved hand resting lightly on his sleeve. In a high-backed chair near the corner sat a figure who might easily have been overlooked. Small, neat, her greying hair pinned into a practical style, her dress modest, her spectacles gleaming faintly in the light. Detective Agatha Marple appeared to be absorbed in a small notebook she held on her lap, but a keen observer would notice how her sharp eyes darted from one guest to another, taking in not just faces but gestures, tones, and glances. Clara Van Doren, a woman of striking beauty and a smile that could charm both paupers and princes, had already drawn her attention. Clara's gown was a deep emerald green, her hair like copper waves beneath the glittering tiara that adorned her brow. Her companion, Gregory Harrington, was as confident as his tailored suit suggested, his laughter full-bodied, his hands expressive as he spoke. Across the room stood Charles Winthrop, his mouth set in a tight line, his arms crossed over his chest. He watched Clara and Gregory with an intensity that made even the sharp-eyed Agatha pause. His brows knit together, and his normally polished demeanour seemed cracked by some internal storm. "Interesting," Agatha murmured to herself, her pencil moving steadily across the page. In her chosen role as a historian documenting the golden age of rail travel, she found herself with ample opportunity to observe. This particular train, with its sumptuous decor and exclusive clientele, provided no shortage of characters to study. Yet, Agatha Marple was not simply documenting for posterity. She was here on behalf of an interested party who believed that this crossing might hold secrets far more intriguing than the details of gilt mirrors and crystal chandeliers. As the train began to move, the click of wheels on rails quickly became a steady rhythm, a reassuring accompaniment to the murmur of conversation and clink of glasses. Outside, the storm raged, flashes of lightning briefly illuminating the countryside, the torrential rain smearing the view. Within, the heat and light seemed to hold the chaos at bay, though Agatha sensed it was only a matter of time before the atmosphere of genteel conviviality would give way to something darker. Several hours later, the expected chaos arrived. The train lurched suddenly, a violent motion that sent glasses toppling, passengers clutching at their armrests, and the chandelier swinging dangerously above. Agatha caught mid-note, snapped her pencil shut, and gripped the edge of her chair. A woman let out a startled cry. "What's happened?" Clara Van Doren exclaimed, her voice sharp with fear. The conductor, pale-faced and visibly shaken, hurried through the car. "Everyone remain calm," he called, though his own tone belied the command. Agatha rose, steadying herself against a pillar, and followed the conductor down the corridor. They entered the dining car, and immediately the source of the panic was clear. Fine china lay shattered on the carpet. A crimson stain from an overturned wine bottle spread slowly across the floor, and slumped over one of the tables, his cap askew, was the driver. The conductor stepped forward, his voice low and urgent. He's dead," he whispered. Agatha, already inspecting the scene, nodded faintly. Whispers spread among the passengers who had gathered at the doorway. Clara appeared, gripping Gregory's arm as though he were the only solid thing in a world suddenly turned upside down. Charles hovered nearby, his expression unreadable, though his fists were clenched at his sides. Agatha turned her attention to the conductor. "You'll want to keep everyone calm and together," she said, her voice even, firm. "There's no need for panic." The conductor nodded, grateful for her composed presence. Then, after glancing about to ensure they were not overheard, he murmured to her, "Miss Marple, we need your help." Agatha's gaze lingered on the lifeless driver. Her thoughts raced, and her pencil was poised once again. "I'll do what I can," she replied quietly. The air around her seemed to hum with tension, the storm outside growing louder, as though echoing the turmoil now brewing within the train. The Grand Salon, so recently the scene of easy laughter and clinking glasses, had taken on a different mood by morning. The storm outside had not abated, but within the train the atmosphere was heavier still. Agatha Marple sat quietly, her notebook resting on her lap, the tip of her pencil poised above the page. She made a small mark, then looked up, her sharp eyes scanning the room. Across from her, Clara Van Doren and Gregory Harrington sat close together. Clara's voice, soft and melodious, carried just enough to reach Agatha's ears. "It's all so frightful," Clara said, her gloved hand resting on Gregory's. "What will we do if it wasn't an accident?" Gregory, leaning forward in his chair, patted Clara's hand. "No need to fret, my dear. I'll see to it you're safe." He smiled, but Agatha noticed his hand lingered a touch too long, his grip too familiar. Clara didn't seem to mind. In fact, she appeared to encourage it, tilting her head and offering a faint, grateful smile. At the edge of the room, Charles Winthrop stood stiffly, his arms folded across his chest. His fair brows were drawn low over his pale grey eyes, and his jaw worked as though he were biting back words. Agatha's gaze shifted between Charles and the pair seated near the fire. His glare rested squarely on Gregory's hand atop Clara's. For a moment, Charles's knuckles whitened, his fists clenching so tightly that Agatha wondered if the man might spring forward at any moment. Instead, he turned sharply and walked out of the salon, his polished shoes clicking smartly against the tiled floor. Satisfied for now, Agatha rose and stepped into the corridor. The rhythmic clatter of the train on its rails provided a constant backdrop as she made her way to the observation car. This was a quieter space, usually populated by those seeking a moment of reflection. Today, however, there was only one occupant. Margaret Wells sat near the window, her profile stark against the grey blur of rain. Agatha approached slowly, her footsteps deliberately soft. Margaret glanced up, her features sharpening when she recognized her visitor. "Miss Marple," she said coolly, "what brings you here?" "Oh, simply the view," Agatha replied, settling into the seat opposite. She opened her notebook, pretending to jot down a few notes. "I find these journeys so inspiring. One never knows what stories a train might hold." Margaret snorted, a decidedly unladylike sound. She lifted her teacup and took a deliberate sip. "You'll find plenty of stories here, I suppose, especially if you're interested in theft." Agatha raised an eyebrow. "Theft, Mrs. Wells?" "Yes," Margaret said sharply, lowering her cup with a clink. "Mr. Harrington, he's no more than a common thief dressed up as a gentleman. That so-called artifact he purchased, that exquisite relic from Egypt, it's mine. He knows it. Stole it right out from under me, he did." She gripped the cup so tightly that Agatha thought it might crack. "I'd been negotiating for months," Margaret continued. "Each steps in at the last moment, throws money around, and it's gone. All the history, all the meaning, it's nothing more than a trinket to him." Agatha kept her expression mild, but her mind was already spinning. "That must be very upsetting," she said gently. "You must feel cheated?" Margaret's mouth tightened, and she said no more. Instead, she turned back to the rain-spattered window, her fingers tapping an agitated rhythm against the porcelain cup. Agatha rose, her pencil scratching one last note in her book. "Thank you for the chat, Mrs. Wells," she said. "I find your perspective most enlightening." She left the observation car, letting her footsteps carry her down the corridor once more. It was later in the afternoon when Agatha found herself passing through one of the narrower hallways near the baggage car. She paused as voices reached her ears, a man and a woman speaking in low, urgent tones. She edged closer, careful not to be seen. "I'm not asking for anything unusual," came Clara's voice, her tone still light but with a steel core beneath the silk. "Just tell me what's in the box. I saw Mr. Harrington give it to you when we boarded. What is it?" The porter's reply was hesitant. "I'm not sure, miss. Just a piece of luggage, that's all." "Nonsense," Clara said, her voice dropping to a purr. "You're a clever man, aren't you? Just a little peek. No one will know." There was a pause. Agatha's pencil remained poised over her notebook. The porter murmured something too low to hear, and then Clara laughed, a tinkling sound that would have seemed charming to anyone who didn't know better. When the conversation ended and the pair went their separate ways, Agatha lingered for a moment, her expression thoughtful. Then she returned to her seat in the salon and made a careful note in her journal. "Clara, more than just charm, intentions unclear. Keep watch." The train rumbled onward into the storm, its whistle echoing in the vast, dark countryside. Inside, the luxury and calm seemed an increasingly thin veneer over something much more treacherous. The dining car, when viewed through the lens of daylight, revealed more than it had in the storm's shadowed chaos. Agatha Marple moved deliberately down the length of the room, her small notebook open in one hand, the other tracing the edge of a table as though feeling for a secret message left in the wood. The faint odour of spilled wine lingered, mingling with the sharp tang of polish. The staff had done their best to restore order, but the heavy sense of unease lingered. It was there, near the centre of the car, that she saw it. A porcelain teacup tipped onto its side, its delicate handle pointed toward her like a beckoning finger, and a faint shimmer of liquid pooled along the rim. Agatha paused, tilting her head to study it. The cup's position was peculiar. It lay not among the shards of shattered glasses and crockery, but alone, untouched by the wider carnage. She pulled a fresh handkerchief from her pocket and leaned in carefully. With slow, deliberate movements, she dabbed at the liquid, her gloved fingers steady as a surgeon's. The light caught a faint iridescence, a film that might have gone unnoticed by anyone less inclined to look. As she straightened, a voice from behind startled her. "You'd think someone would have tidied that up by now," said a stout woman with a large hat perched precariously on her curls. It was Mrs. Crantley, a frequent traveller, who seemed to know every member of the train's staff by name. "That poor driver. He only came in here to sit for a moment, didn't even order anything, just picked up a cup from the sideboard." "Did he indeed?" Agatha asked lightly, turning to face Mrs. Cramley. "How very odd." "Odd? I don't see what's odd about it." Mrs. Cramley leaned in conspiratorially. The man was exhausted, poor thing. Why shouldn't he help himself to a drink if no one was looking? "I say, Miss Marple, you're looking rather serious. You don't think—" Agatha held up a hand to gently cut her off. "No conclusions yet, Mrs. Cramley. I'm simply noting the details." She folded her handkerchief carefully and tucked it away. If I may ask, when you say he didn't order anything, you mean he simply walked in and—" "Walked right over, yes. I was just coming in from the other end of the car. I saw him pick up that cup from the sideboard and sit down for a moment. Hardly touched it before—" She broke off, a troubled expression crossing her features. "Before what?" "Before he died, of course," Agatha thought grimly, but she only nodded, as if Mrs. Cranley had confirmed something simple, such as the time of day. "Thank you," Agatha said. "You've been most helpful." She watched as Mrs. Cranley moved toward her usual seat, her large hat bobbing with each step. Left alone, Agatha turned back to the scene. Her mind traced the possibilities like the branching lines of a railway map. If the driver had not ordered that drink, but rather picked it up from somewhere else, it meant that cup was not meant for him at all. The true intended recipient? That was a different question altogether. Agatha tapped her pencil against her chin, her brow furrowing as she pieced the fragments together. An unattended cup, a driver who merely sought a moment's rest, a sip taken, and then disaster. With a final glance around the dining car, Agatha made a quiet note in her book, shut it, and left the room. The train carried on its relentless journey, but within its confines the mystery was already beginning to shift shape. The poison was never meant for the driver, and Agatha Marple intended to find out exactly who it was meant for. Agatha Marple approached Gregory Harrington's cabin with measured steps. The rhythmic clatter of the train seemed muted as she drew closer, the sound of her heels tapping softly against the polished floor the only accompaniment to her thoughts. She paused at his door for a moment, adjusted her spectacles, and rapped lightly. "Yes? Who's there?" came the brusque reply. "Miss Marple?" she said. "Might I have a word, Mr. Harrington?" There was a pause, then the shuffle of movement inside. The door opened just a fraction, revealing Gregory's angular face, his dark eyes glinting with something not quite fear, not quite irritation. He pulled the door open further, stepping back to allow her entry. "Forgive the intrusion," she said as she entered. The cabin was richly appointed, though a little more cluttered than she might have expected from a man of Gregory's reputed fastidiousness. A leather case lay open on the seat by the window, papers half spilling out, along with what appeared to be a dark cloth bundle. "Please," Gregory said, gesturing vaguely at the single chair opposite his. He looked harried, a thin sheen of sweat on his brow. His usually immaculate dark hair was slightly tousled, as though he'd been running his hands through it, a telltale sign of unease. He sat down heavily on the small couch, leaning forward with his hands clasped between his knees. "What is it now, Miss Marple?" he asked. The words rushed and sharp. "I've already given my account to the conductor. I was nowhere near the dining car when it happened. I'm not suggesting otherwise," Agatha replied gently. She settled herself into the chair, smoothing her skirt as she did. "But there are some peculiarities I can't quite ignore. The matter of the drink, for instance. I understand that the driver took a cup that had been left unattended. A curious detail, don't you think?" Gregory's eyes narrowed slightly. "What are you getting at?" "Only that it raises questions. For instance, who left the cup there and why?" Gregory ran a hand through his hair, a quick, jerky motion. "How should I know? I wasn't there. I've no enemies on board, no reason anyone would—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "It's ridiculous. Why would anyone want me dead?" Agatha tilted her head, her expression serene. "Why would you think the poison was meant for you, Mr. Harrington?" He froze, then quickly barked a laugh. "You're fishing, Miss Marple. A fine angler, no doubt, but I'm afraid you're wasting your time. I've no reason to suspect anyone would try to harm me. You should look elsewhere." "Perhaps," she said mildly, "but I can't help wondering about the artifact you brought on board." She gestured faintly toward the open case, though her gaze never wavered from his face. "It seems rather unique, and one hears that unique objects often carry unique consequences." Gregory's expression hardened. "What do you mean by that?" "Margaret Wells has mentioned her claim to it." "Margaret?" He spat the name like a curse. "That woman's a liar. She's bitter and grasping. That piece—" He stopped, took a deep breath, and continued more calmly. "That artifact is mine. I paid for it, fairly. Margaret's claims are nonsense. She was never in any serious negotiation for it. All she has is sour grapes." Agatha considered him for a long moment, then smiled faintly. "Thank you for clarifying that, Mr. Harrington." She rose, smoothing her skirt again. "I won't trouble you further." Gregory remained seated, his knuckles pale as he gripped the edge of the couch. "You find nothing of interest here, Miss Marple?" "Perhaps not," she said lightly. "Still, I find it helpful to speak directly with those involved. One never knows what might emerge." She left the cabin and stepped back into the corridor. Her expression was serene, but her mind was racing. Gregory Harrington might insist he had no enemies on board, but the tension in his voice and the defensiveness of his posture suggested otherwise. There was more to his story, and Agatha Marple was determined to find it. The grand salon was lively, though the chatter seemed forced. A string quartet played softly in one corner, their music a valiant attempt to restore normalcy. But beneath the polished veneer of refinement there was a distinct tension in the air, like a tightly wound spring ready to snap. The storm outside, which had not abated since their departure, rumbled ominously, and every so often a flash of lightning would illuminate the room. The passengers exchanged murmurs and glances, all too aware that the events of the previous night had left an indelible mark. Seated near the bar, Clara Van Doren laughed, too loudly, too brightly, at something Gregory Harrington had just said. She was dressed in another elegant evening gown, her emerald necklace catching the light. Gregory, leaning casually against the bar, looked the picture of confidence, his glass of brandy held lightly in one hand, but the faint smirk on his lips betrayed a certain smugness, and his eyes darted occasionally toward the door as if expecting someone. That someone appeared in the form of Charles Winthrop, who strode into the salon with an air of barely contained fury. His usual composure was conspicuously absent. His tie was slightly askew, his hair uncharacteristically mussed. He headed straight for Clara and Gregory, his steps purposeful, his eyes locked onto them like a hunter closing in on prey. "Clara!" he said sharply, his voice cutting through the music. She turned, her expression instantly frosty. "Charles!" she replied, her tone laced with disdain. "How lovely of you to join us!" "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded, ignoring her sarcasm. "I leave the room for 5 minutes, and here you are." He gestured angrily at Gregory. "Entertaining him again." Clara's eyes narrowed. "Entertaining? I'm not some parlour magician, Charles. I'm having a conversation, if that's even allowed in your rigid little world." Gregory chuckled softly, swirling the brandy in his glass. "No need to take it personally, old chap. Clara and I were just catching up. Nothing more." "Nothing more?" Charles's voice rose, and a few passengers nearby glanced over. He pointed at Gregory, his hand trembling slightly. "You've been hovering around her from the start. What exactly are your intentions, Harrington?" Gregory raised an eyebrow, looking entirely unfazed. "My intentions? I'm merely enjoying the company of a charming lady. Is that a crime?" Clara placed a hand on Gregory's arm, her lips curling into a smile. "There's no need to explain yourself, Gregory. Charles seems to think he owns me, which of course he doesn't." The murmurs grew louder among the passengers. A portly gentleman seated by the fire whispered something to his wife, who nodded solemnly. 2 younger women, dressed in the height of 1920 fashion, craned their necks to catch every word. Even the musicians faltered, their melody stumbling as their attention strayed toward the argument. Charles took a step closer, his face reddening. "I don't claim to own you, Clara, but I do claim the right to ask why you're so willing to—" He struggled for the word, his gaze flicking to Gregory's smirk. "Flirt with someone you barely know?" Clara stood, her chair scraping against the floor. She was suddenly taller than both men, her eyes flashing. "I'll speak to whomever I please, Charles. You may think you have some claim to me, but you're sorely mistaken. I won't have you accusing me, publicly no less, of improprieties that exist only in your mind." Gregory took another sip of his brandy, clearly enjoying the spectacle. Now, he said, "let's not turn this into a scene." "You stay out of this," Charles snapped. His hand was clenched into a fist at his side, and for a moment it seemed he might strike Gregory. Clara stepped between them, raising her chin defiantly. "Stop it," she commanded, "both of you, this childish posturing. Honestly, you're embarrassing yourselves." At the far corner of the room, Agatha Marple sat quietly, a small notebook in her lap. She had chosen a seat that afforded her a clear view of the salon. Her pencil moved steadily as she recorded the interaction. Each glance, each word, each flicker of emotion was noted. The hostility in Charles's eyes, the smug amusement in Gregory's, the calculated shift in Clara's tone. All were pieces of a larger puzzle. As the confrontation drew the attention of nearly everyone in the room, Agatha remained unnoticed, her expression calm. She knew the difference between petty bickering and true animosity. This, she thought, had long since crossed the line into dangerous territory. The rain continued to beat against the windows as the train rumbled steadily southward. In the observation car the light was muted, the damp grey of the storm seeping through the large windows. Margaret Wells sat stiffly in her usual spot by the far end of the car, her teacup untouched before her. She stared out at the blurred landscape, her shoulders rigid beneath the high collar of her plum-coloured dress. Agatha Marple entered quietly, her footsteps soft against the carpeted floor. She did not immediately approach Margaret, instead pausing by the opposite window and gazing out at the passing countryside. After a moment she turned her head slightly. "Such a gloomy day," she remarked. "Rather fitting, isn't it?" Margaret stiffened, but did not look away from the window. "If you've come to interrogate me, Miss Marple, I'll save you the trouble. I've nothing to say." Agatha smiled faintly and moved closer, lowering herself into the chair across from Margaret. "You know," she said lightly, "in my research, I've often found that people's initial reluctance to talk is simply an indication that they have something worth saying." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "I confronted him," she said suddenly, her voice sharp. "I admit it. I told Gregory exactly what I thought of him." Agatha tilted her head, encouraging her to continue. Margaret turned her gaze away from the window and fixed it on her untouched tea. Her hands, resting on the table, trembled slightly. "He's a liar, Miss Marple," she said bitterly. "The artifact he carries around so smugly. It's not his by right. It's part of my family's legacy. He knows it, but he doesn't care. He bought it out from under me, and now he parades it about like a trophy." Agatha studied Margaret's hands, the tension in her fingers as they tightened around the handle of the teacup. "And when did you confront him?" she asked gently. Before the incident in the dining car," Margaret admitted. "But I didn't kill anyone. I wouldn't. I just wanted to rattle him, to make him squirm. I thought perhaps he'd think twice before flaunting what he stole." Her voice wavered, and she bit her lip, as if she had said too much. Agatha nodded slowly. "I understand," she said softly. It must be terribly frustrating, feeling as though something so important to you has been taken unjustly." Margaret looked up sharply, as if searching for signs of mockery in Agatha's expression. She found none. "It is," she said after a moment, her voice barely above a whisper. "But frustration isn't murder." "Of course not," Agatha agreed. She reached out, her hand brushing Margaret's wrist lightly. "I don't think you mean harm, Mrs. Wells, but I do think you've been carrying a great deal of resentment." Margaret's face flushed, and her gaze dropped to the table again. "Resentment isn't a crime." "No," Agatha said, "but it can lead to actions that might seem questionable." She withdrew her hand, reaching instead for her own notebook. "Thank you for being honest with me. I appreciate it." Margaret didn't respond, her attention firmly fixed on her cooling tea. Agatha rose quietly, smoothing her skirt. "If you remember anything else, anything at all, please don't hesitate to tell me." As Agatha walked back toward the main cars, her mind churned with the implications of Margaret's words. The woman's hands had trembled, her voice wavered, and her defences had cracked under the pressure of her own emotions. Margaret might not be the killer, but there was no doubt she held secrets that could very well lead Agatha closer to the truth. The storm outside had finally begun to wane, though the clouds remained a heavy, brooding presence over the rolling countryside. In her quiet corner of the observation car, Agatha Marple sat with her notebook open before her. The pages were filled with her tidy, precise handwriting, notes, observations, and small sketches that marked the key moments of the journey. Slowly, she tapped the end of her pencil against her chin, her sharp eyes fixed on the rain-streaked glass before her. She was not looking at the landscape, but rather at the tableau within her own mind. One by one she assembled the puzzle pieces: the poisoned cup, the overheard conversations, the strained relationships and simmering jealousies that had churned beneath the surface. The story was all there, if only one cared to see it. And Agatha did. Her pencil stilled as the picture came into focus. The poisoned drink had not been intended for the driver. That much was clear. He had merely been a man in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was Gregory Harrington who should have taken that sip, who should have succumbed to the lethal contents of that delicate porcelain cup. Agatha's mind played out the scene as it must have happened. Charles Winthrop, whose temper had flared time and again during the journey, had been driven to the edge by jealousy. Watching Gregory's easy charm, his smug laughter, and his growing closeness to Clara had been too much. Clara, the beautiful, beguiling woman who kept both men in her orbit, always smiling, always just out of reach. Charles had convinced himself that removing Gregory would finally win him Clara's affection. And so the cup had been prepared, placed just so, waiting for Gregory to claim it. But Gregory had never drunk from that cup. For all his arrogance, his habit of taking things that were not rightfully his, Margaret's artifact for one, Gregory had been spared by sheer chance. The driver, weary and unsuspecting, had lifted the cup instead, and now Gregory, oblivious to how narrowly he had escaped death, continued to strut through the train, unaware of the danger that had been meant for him. Agatha leaned back in her chair, her thoughts turning to Clara. How much did she know? Clara's manipulation of Gregory, her coy smiles, her subtle probing questions, suggested she had her own designs on the artifact he carried. She had played him skillfully, though perhaps not entirely without affection. And yet, despite her charm, Clara was not the key. The key was Charles, whose desperation and anger had clouded his judgment, leading him to this fatal mistake. Agatha's expression hardened. The truth was clear now, clear as the faint gleam on that cup's rim. And once you saw the truth, she thought, you could never unsee it. The grand salon, for all its crystal chandeliers and velvet upholstery, had taken on a different atmosphere in the wake of the storm. Outside, the rain had ceased, leaving only a muted grey sky. Inside, however, the tension hung as heavy as any thundercloud. Agatha Marple sat in her usual corner, her notebook closed upon her lap. She looked at each of her assembled guests. Charles Winthrop, Clara Van Doren, Gregory Harrington, and Margaret Wells. They sat in a loose semicircle, their expressions ranging from discomfort to open hostility. "Thank you all for joining me," Agatha began, her voice calm but carrying a note of authority. "I know that recent events have unsettled us all, but I believe it's time to lay out the truth. The death of our unfortunate driver, as shocking as it was not a simple accident. It was, in fact, the result of a deliberate act, an act that was never meant to claim his life." Gregory shifted in his chair, his hand moving to his pocket watch in a habitual gesture. "Miss Marple, I must say—" "You'll have your chance to speak, Mr. Harrington," Agatha interrupted smoothly. "For now, I ask that you listen." She turned her gaze to Charles, whose face was pale, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. "Mr. Winthrop, I am afraid it begins with you." "Me?" Charles snapped, his voice rising. "What are you implying?" "I'm not implying," Agatha replied. "I'm stating that the poisoned drink was meant for Mr. Harrington. It was placed where you knew he would find it, but fate intervened, and our poor driver, seeking only a moment's respite, took the cup instead. You see, Mr. Winthrop, jealousy is a dangerous emotion. It clouds judgment, and you, driven by your feelings for Miss Van Doren, let it cloud yours." Charles's eyes darted toward Clara, whose expression remained serene. "That's absurd!" he exclaimed. "I would never—" "Wouldn't you?" Agatha asked, her voice calm but insistent. "You watched as Mr. Harrington charmed his way into Miss Van Doren's company, basked in her attention. You let resentment build until it consumed you, and you thought that by removing him you would finally have her all to yourself." "I didn't mean—" Charles began, his voice faltering. "It wasn't supposed to—" Clara, who had remained silent until now, spoke in a soft, almost musical tone. "Charles, really? Such dramatics!" Agatha turned to her. "And you, Miss Van Doren, while Charles's motives were fueled by passion, yours were of a colder nature. You have, from the start, been more interested in Mr. Harrington's artifact than in his company. The questions you asked, the subtle manipulations, they were not those of a woman in love, but of someone trying to secure something valuable." Clara's lips curved into a faint smile, though her eyes remained cool. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple." "Oh, I think you do," Agatha said. "You played your part brilliantly, charming Mr. Harrington, encouraging Mr. Winthrop's jealousy, even distracting Margaret Wells when it suited you. But in the end your game depended on Mr. Harrington remaining alive. You would never have sanctioned an act as extreme as poisoning." Gregory, who had been listening with growing agitation, finally burst out. "This is preposterous! I've done nothing wrong. All I did was purchase an artifact, fair and square. The rest is nonsense." Agatha turned to him, her expression unreadable. "You may believe that, Mr. Harrington, but your arrogance, your carelessness, set this entire chain of events into motion. Margaret claims the artifact rightfully belongs to her family, and you dismissed her concerns. You flaunted it as if it were a trophy, heedless of the consequences. While you did not put the poison in that cup, your actions created the conditions that led to it." Gregory's face reddened, but he said nothing more, sinking back into his chair. Charles by now had his head in his hands. His voice emerged, muffled and broken. It was never supposed to be him. I didn't mean to." He looked up, his eyes wet with tears. I couldn't let Gregory take her." There was a long silence. Agatha let it linger, allowing the weight of Charles's words to settle over the room. When she finally spoke, her tone was softer. "I believe you, Mr. Winthrop. I believe you never intended to harm the driver. But the fact remains that your actions led to his death, and now we must face the consequences." Charles nodded, his shoulders slumping as if the confession had drained him of all strength. Agatha rose, her notebook still closed in her hand. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think that will suffice for now." The storm outside had calmed, but within the grand salon the storm of human passions had left its mark. The train slowed as it approached the station, the shrill whistle echoing into the misty morning. Passengers pressed against the windows, eager to glimpse the waiting platform. Among them, Charles Winthrop sat pale and silent, flanked by a pair of sombre railway officials. His hands were bound, though the restraint seemed unnecessary. Charles had no fight left in him. As the train eased to a halt, the authorities boarded quickly, their presence efficient and impersonal. They led him away without ceremony, his gaze fixed downward as he stepped onto the platform. In the grand salon, Clara Van Doren stood stiffly, her gloved hands clasped before her. The sparkle of her emerald necklace seemed dulled, as though the brilliance had been leached away by the events of the previous days. Gregory Harrington remained by the window, looking every inch the debonair businessman, until one noticed the tightness in his jaw and the faint sheen of perspiration on his brow. The stir of whispers among the remaining passengers was like the rustle of wind through dry leaves. At the far end of the car, Margaret Wells gathered her belongings. She moved deliberately, her head high, though her shoulders bore a weight not entirely due to her age. The artifact that had fueled so much turmoil remained out of reach, locked in a compartment neither she nor Gregory could claim without a legal battle. As she passed by Clara, the two women exchanged the briefest of glances, an acknowledgment of a shared defeat. And Agatha Marple? She walked quietly through the now still train, her modest handbag in one hand, her notebook in the other. She nodded politely to the conductor as he passed, his face lined with gratitude and exhaustion. Agatha had never sought recognition. She had only sought the truth. Now, as the train sat still and the storm outside had given way to a pale winter sun, she allowed herself a rare smile. The storm within, however, would not pass so quickly. The platform buzzed with activity. Passengers disembarked, some with weary expressions, others eager to be on their way. The usual cacophony of porters calling out names and destinations blended with the hiss of steam and the occasional bark of a vendor peddling newspapers. In the midst of it all, Agatha stepped off the train. She was dressed as simply as she had been at the journey's start, an unremarkable figure in a practical coat and sturdy shoes. Her valise was small, her steps unhurried. The conductor approached her, his cap in hand. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice filled with genuine warmth, "I can't thank you enough for what you've done. We didn't know what to do." Agatha smiled faintly, waving a gloved hand. "You're too kind. I merely observed a few things, that's all. Any sensible person would have done the same." The conductor shook his head as if to protest, but she had already turned away. She did not linger to hear his reply. She stepped into the crowd, her slight figure quickly swallowed by the swirl of travellers and luggage. As she walked away from the train station, the morning light catching the edge of her spectacles, Agatha Marple felt a quiet satisfaction. The tale of the Orange Blossom Special would likely become a footnote in her collection of cases, but to her it was one more affirmation that truth, no matter how well concealed, could always be unearthed.